Hey guys, how are you all doing? Hope you've all been enjoying Armored Core, or at least enjoying something else that brings you some form of joy or entertainment. This is going to be a slightly different video than usual, less of a build video and more of a meditation on Elden Ring's multiplayer in general. For all the accolades that Elden Ring received, and honestly very much deserved, I felt there were several ways in which the multiplayer aspect of this game truly fell flat. Just to be clear, this video isn't going to be one of those "we need solo host invasions back" videos, and if you're familiar with my videos, you know it's not going to be a FromSoft needs to make invasions opt-in type of video either. And that's also largely because we all know that invasions have always been an opt-in sort of thing. You just don't check a box that says opt-in or opt-out of invasions. But anyways. Instead, this is a much more holistic view of FromSoft's multiplayer and how it really doesn't work all that well with Elden Ring's open world format. I'm going to cover a lot in this video, hence why it's so long. But I'm going to talk about stuff like the broken downscaling for overleveled summons, a lack of progress carrying over between players in co-op, open world invasions, and the arms race this creates that makes PvP a far less enjoyable experience than in previous games. And I know my audience here. If you're subbed to me, it's because you like invasions. But I also want to make this video for co-opers too, because it's important to acknowledge that the multiplayer community of these games is an ecosystem. After all, we don't invade in a vacuum. We depend on a much larger population of co-opers, and we have to acknowledge that their experience should come first before ours as invaders. It's essentially a predator-prey relationship, and I do not mean to imply that in a demeaning way for co-opers in the slightest. It's just that without successful and enjoyable co-op, there are no invasions for us invaders, and thus that population of co-opers needs to flourish. If co-opers stop playing because the experience is legitimately unenjoyable, we invaders are left with nobody to invade except Taunter's-tongued, rune-arced Grace Duelists. And if those are the only people left to invade, I will simply just play a different game. I have to imagine that this apocalyptic state of Elden Ring multiplayer is not something you or FromSoft would want for this game. This video is going to be divided into 3 sections in order to cover the biggest pain points that make Elden Ring's holistic multiplayer system truly lack the cohesion that was evident in previous FromSoftware games. The first section covers how open world co-op in this game is disjointed and mostly an absolute bore due to outdated systems that don't fit a game of this size and scale. The second is that the downscaling system for summoning higher level players fundamentally breaks the PvE and PvP, which then compounds with the open world and renders both formats unenjoyable. And the third and final section addresses my long-held assertion that open world invasions are just unfun for all parties involved, due to a lack of design intention for how they are implemented into an open world. If any of these sections sounds boring or redundant to you, just hit the bricks. You are under no obligation to listen to a long rant about how unfun the co-op is in Elden Ring if you never play co-op, or how garbage the downscaling is if you've never spent many an invasion getting one-shotted by overleveled summons. I made this monstrously sized video to just capture as much information as possible and present it to you. I'm casting the widest of nets here. Any wider and I'd be making some garbage ranking all the bosses in Elden Ring style video, or even worse, I'd include a "with hate mail" in the title and like 2 emojis in the thumbnail. I'd encourage you all to watch or listen to the parts of this video that you're the most interested in, and just skip the parts you don't find compelling. All of our time is valuable, and while YouTube's algorithm desperately wants you to constantly increase the duration of your viewership, I really don't give a shit. Watch what you want, but don't waste your time. I said in my last video that the age of reflection was coming to a close, and I believe this to be its final send-off, essentially the culmination of spending a year and a half with this game that we waited so long for and put a few too many of our hopes and dreams in. Regrettably, it is a critique of the multiplayer of this game rather than the celebration of it that we'd all prefer. I've found Elden Ring to be maybe the most difficult of all of FromSoft's games to do a full playthrough of in co-op, not due to the difficulty, but for the sheer effort and length required of just one playthrough. Through all of their titles, FromSoft has made simultaneous playthrough co-op, using similarly leveled player characters, kind of a huge pain in the ass. That is because progress does not carry over in co-op sessions. Progress through a whole level and defeat a boss in your friend's world? Well, time to play that exact same level and fight that exact same boss again in your world. Now, this has never been that big of a deal to me in the past. I've done many playthroughs of these games with my friends while leveling and progressing alongside them. In fact, I remember an instance in Dark Souls 3 where there were like 3 of us doing a simultaneous playthrough, so every portion of the game had to be done 3 times. And situations got even trickier when we would get to certain areas where a Lord of Cinder was the boss, and in order to summon that third co-opper in those areas, you had to pop a dried finger and open up 2 invader slots. It made things dramatically more hectic and probably a little bit more difficult to progress through, but it was really fun to get that many more invasions. It was a really great time, but man, it took forever. Imagine having to progress through Farron Swamp while being hunted by like 2 to 3 invaders 3 times in a row. Now, I also get the purpose behind progress not carrying over. I understand that the original purpose and the design intent behind it was that you would be co-oping with randoms, so you'd pick up players that you didn't necessarily know, help them, and then leave. But as the Souls titles have progressed, they've added more and more features so that you can play with people you know, people who are your friends, people who you want to continue to play the game with. So we're at a point where they've made all these concessions for you to play with friends, but they're still treating the game like it's supposed to be these dropping in and out random co-op sessions. And part of the reason not that many people complained about the lack of progress carrying over was that these games just simply weren't that long in the past, so you could feasibly do 2 simultaneous playthroughs at the same time. But that's not the case anymore in a game as massive as Elden Ring. I cannot imagine playing this game in a simultaneous playthrough and doing everything twice. There is just so much to do even for one person. On my first playthrough of the game, I did every single catacomb I could find in Limgrave, the Weeping Peninsula, and Liurnium. That by the time I hit the Altus Plateau, I just had no appetite for any of the catacombs beyond that, thus missing out on some of FromSoft's best dungeons due to sheer fatigue. In fact, I would find catacombs later in Altus, Caelid, and the mountaintops, touch the grace point, and then just leave. That was born entirely out of content fatigue. But now, imagine exploring that open world with someone else, trying to explore at your own pace, and then basically having to do that exact same thing again in 10 to 20 minutes. And it's hard to explore at your own pace when you and your co-op buddy are constantly taking turns exploring the exact same content. And when you factor in just how massive this game is, it's exhausting. It's just too much game to be played twice every session. So please, for the love of God, if we're going to get another open world game, and especially another open world game of this size from FromSoftware, can progress please be shared between co-op partners? If progress was shared, that would encourage far more people to play the game together at the same time at relatively the same level. Whereas right now, even people who love and adore this game don't want to do a whole playthrough of an area twice every session. It'd in fact be much easier to just summon the friend who already beat the game and have them meet you at each side of grace. Speaking of Sites of Grace, I also just think there are far too many of them in this game. This has been a slowly creeping issue ever since Dark Souls 3, but checkpoints are now so common that it's no longer much of a challenge to traverse the areas between them. I remember in some interviews before release, FromSoft talked a little about the Stake of Marika as a way to ensure that runbacks and progress loss wouldn't be too big of a deal in an open world. To me, that also sounded like it would be a stand-in for when they wouldn't necessarily want to place a checkpoint next to every single boss. But that ended up mattering less because there are a bajillion Sites of Grace anyways, and practically one next to every single boss. There's also a little issue here with Stakes of Marika. If the host dies to a boss, they get the option of respawning at a nearby Stake of Marika. But if they have summons with them, they do not get this option as well. Instead, the host either has to go back to the beginning of the level to fetch their summons, or the summons have to run through the whole level in their world to get to the Stake of Marika and then drop their sign. It's not the biggest deal because you really only have to do the latter part once, but it's just another design choice that to me feels like they didn't even consider how it would play out during a co-op session. And that feeling really only grows when you're playing co-op and you cannot sit at a site of grace that you just found because you have a summon in your world. And it's even more annoying when that is constantly happening because you are constantly finding sites of grace. Every time you want to sit at a site of grace, you have to kick your summon out and then resummon them when you're done. And it's just an added annoyance when you just want to adjust your spells or reallocate and upgrade flasks. I will definitely admit that this is one of my more minor nitpicks with the game itself, but I think it's part of that overall problem of the multiplayer not feeling cohesive in this game whatsoever. In an open world game where all you want to do is explore, we spend a lot of time waiting for people's signs to appear, or being locked out of mechanics we need to use because now someone's in our world and we can't rest at a grace point. I wouldn't have as much of a problem with the system if it was your regular old FromSoft game. But it's not, it's an open world game and it deserves a more refined and thoughtful multiplayer system than just whatever they did in the past. At the very least, hosts and summons should be able to sit at a side of grace while in co-op in the open world, as long as there isn't an invader present. That way you could actually attune the spells you find while exploring the open world, or access your storage boxes, or mix your wondrous physics with the new tiers that you find by killing bosses. But as it stands, nope, gotta kick everyone out to do these things. This is beside the point, but I should also mention that I'm a little over the concept of bonfires as a mechanic in general. When they were introduced in Dark Souls 1, bonfires were like a way to simulate the long rest mechanic from Dungeons & Dragons that also doubled as a progress checkpoint. I suppose I'm just frustrated that the mechanic has never evolved at any point, not even to the point of your companions and summons being allowed to rest alongside you at a bonfire. Nothing really has ever changed about bonfires. In fact, they've lost features since Dark Souls 1. We just keep using them because, again, it's what FromSoft did in the past. Maybe my least favorite thing about how co-op currently works is that co-opers are forced to explore the open world that is designed for horseback traversal on foot. Yes, the lands between is spread out and scaled to make hurtling around on the back of Torrent enjoyable, and no, you cannot do that with a friend. Nearly every co-op playthrough I have ever done with a friend has died in either Liurnia or Altus, because doing all of Limgrave on foot was maybe tolerable, but sprinting across the giant lake of Liurnia is certainly not. And after a wonderfully designed, more focused dungeon like the Rune-Strewn Precipice, your reward is even more running across open fields in the Altus Plateau. But the amount of content in the open world that was clearly meant for traversal with Torrent that simply isn't in co-op at all is a little comical. Want to access, I don't know, any Spirit Spring in co-op? Too bad. Want to access this Everjail with a friend? The only way you can is to pick up their summon sign after you both use Torrent in your own worlds. Want to fight the Alabaster Lord that drops Gravitas in co-op? Can't, because you need Torrent to get down there. What about this jumping puzzle at Lena's Rise in Caelid? Absolutely not. What about fighting a dragon in co-op? You know, the boss types who will get up and fly away from you and perform fire-breathing attacks that do approximately 75% of your health. The kind of attacks and maneuvers that you would kind of expect to be able to follow around or dodge on horseback? Yeah, no. Stand there and get flamed on. Oh, but what about Fire Giant? A boss who also kind of does the exact same thing, like move around real fast and throw fire at you? Yeah, you guessed it. Nope, gotta fight him on foot if you want to do it with a buddy. I get that there were likely some technical limitations as to why they didn't want multiple people running around on horseback in this massive open world. But what I don't understand is why the Elden Ring co-op mod is able to let multiple people ride horses with some degree of effectiveness, whereas FromSoftware just gave a blanket no to this. Hell, I even saw people making videos with that same mod and they jammed like 20 people in their world. And even if 2 separate players on horseback was truly an insurmountable goal for them in the open world, an easy solution would just be to have 2 players ride Torrent at the same time. Sure, that might look a little goofy, but Torrent is like half mountain goat, half horse. He looks pretty sturdy. I think he could handle toting around 2 players even with their character sliders maxed out. I'd rather something look goofy just in co-op with your friend who's also made probably some monstrosity with the character creator than having to explore this massive open world designed for horseback traversal on foot. So, let's say you've been wandering through one of the many massive regions with your buddy, walking everywhere of course, and lo and behold you find a cave, marked with torches on the outside, signifying that it's one of the many overworld mini-dungeons scattered across the region. As you approach the entrance to this cave, your head swimming with the promises of puzzles, traps, a guaranteed boss fight, and loot, a fog wall suddenly appears blocking your way. And this is not one of those fog walls you can pass through, it's one that just blocks the way while the rest of the level design is saying, "Come here, there's interesting stuff in this cave." Your only recourse here is to kick out the person you're co-oping with because... yeah, not really sure why we can't just go up and grab a bonfire like that. It's entirely because this is how FromSoft has zoned their multiplayer. You have mini dungeons, which are their own multiplayer zone, and an overworld, which is its own multiplayer zone. But due to the way that they've designed it, there can be no overlap between those if you are currently in multiplayer. And for these dungeons, like, I get that the game will want you to resummon your co-op partner at the beginning of the mini dungeon so that you'll both replenish your resources for the start. But I don't see why you have to kick them out before you can even reach the bonfire. The fact that you can't even enter the dungeon with a friend makes very little sense to me, and the game does nothing to explain this either. To make matters worse, what I see happen a lot is a host will send their summon home, waiting outside the dungeon fog wall, only to get invaded right before the summon is severed. So the fog wall will remain up because the host is technically still in multiplayer. This of course totally screws the host for no good reason other than that this massive open world isn't nearly as seamless as it should be. As you can imagine, I have more beef with how this game is zoned for multiplayer. Another thing that Souls games have made a part of their multiplayer systems dating back to Demon Souls was that co-op and invasions were tied to bosses. If the boss of an area was alive, you could get invaded and also co-op in that area. And if you defeated that boss, you no longer could get invaded or co-op against the PvE in that area. DS2 kind of broke this rule in some ways that weren't incredibly consequential, but it's pretty much the only exception to this rule. The system worked quite well in a game like Dark Souls 3, where levels had a definitive starting point and an ending point, with a boss as a capstone of that level. But in an open world, that system kind of falls apart when there isn't a definitive ending point in each level. Nonetheless, this boss-based multiplayer system was carried over into Elden Ring, and in my opinion, the way it's executed doesn't really make sense. Take Limgrave for example. There are 3 open world bosses with on-screen health bars in the area: Tree Sentinel, the Flying Dragon Agil, and the Tibia Mariner. Killing a combination of I believe 2 of these bosses locks you out of multiplayer for the rest of that area. I say I believe because I cannot find any actual concrete evidence as to which bosses actually lock you out of multiplayer and which don't. And as someone with just general knowledge of how this game works, how would you ever know that? The game never tells you this, that's for certain. When researching this video, it seems like the internet doesn't really know either. All I got were a bunch of incorrectly answered questions on Reddit from when the game first launched, and of course, Effextra Life Wiki is always the same garbage it's always been. A poorly maintained wiki that has a lot of incorrect information on there that can't bother to catch up with the current patches, that is mainly used so that whoever runs the damn site can get a lot of botted views on Twitch. So, as for how the other regions work with their bosses, I'm not totally sure. I tested this myself and killed different variations of bosses in Limgrave, and I could not find a consistent combination of bosses that would do the trick. Sometimes it was Agil and Tree Sentinel, other times it was Tree Sentinel and Tibia Mariner, which honestly kind of helps my point that this system is nonsensical. Hardly anyone understands it, and even if you want to find out, well, you're shit out of luck. I do know that defeating the Draconic Tree Sentinel will lock you out of co-op for much of the Altus Plateau, but other than that, I got nothing for Liurnia or Caelid too. How are you supposed to know when you've defeated that boss that locks you out of multiplayer for the open world region, you might ask? That's the fun part, you don't. The only way to find out is to go summon your buddy and find that, nope, the game has decided that you're now done with multiplayer for that region. Of course, you can still summon for the mini dungeons where the boss is still alive, and that makes more sense to me, as that's been in line with the design philosophy of past Souls games. But having multiplayer tied to boss fights in an open world doesn't make any sense because there's nothing funneling players towards the boss fight as a natural endpoint of a level. In fact, it defeats the whole purpose of an open world design, which is that there is no natural endpoint of a level. It's about exploring at your own pace and going wherever you please. Locking players out of open world co-op without warning is just a bizarre design decision that simply isn't congruent to open world exploration. The last thing I really want to talk about for this section is the Furl Calling Finger Remedy item. It's a really great symbol of everything I've talked about thus far because it is such an absolute vestige of a system that worked really well in previous FromSoft games and now just really doesn't fit in its new format. My first question about the Feral Calling Finger remedy is just, why does it exist? Like, if we removed it entirely from the game and made it so that its effects were always active, would that meaningfully change anyone's experience? Initially, I thought it would be the sort of thing that they made valuable, like humanity or embers were in Dark Souls 1 and 3. A coveted and slightly rare item that unlocked multiplayer and that was lost in death. But no, Feral Calling Finger remedies are ubiquitous. It's the very first thing you learn how to craft, and the flower required to craft the remedies grows abundantly in the game's first 3 main regions. So I ask again, why does this even exist? If FromSoft wants online play to be easily accessible, why don't we just have players who launch the game in online mode stay online when they're playing? Initially, I thought that remedies might be used to turn the entire multiplayer function of the game on, including messages and the shadows of other players running around their worlds. And you know, this would kind of cater to people who get really annoyed at messages, which is kind of a ridiculous thing to get really annoyed by because you can just choose not to read them. But hey, maybe I thought initially they might be, you know, trying to throw those people a bone. But no, they're not doing that either. It's just for summoning people. The only reason I can think of as to why the Feral Calling Finger remedy exists for like a design purpose is to make a distinction between when the player can summon Spirit Ashes and when they can summon other players. But like, why do we need a whole item to do that? The game already arbitrarily decides when and where you can summon Spirit Ashes by graying them out when you cannot use them, and that's a fine enough system. The only explanation I can come up with for why the Feral Calling Finger remedies exist is because this is just how FromSoft has designed their multiplayer systems for a while now. But if that's really the reason, I think that's fairly telling of how multiplayer is implemented into a game that is dramatically different from their previous titles. When you remove the scarcity and gameplay benefits of items like humanity and embers, you're left with Feral Calling Finger remedies, an item that truly adds nothing to the game except another hoop to jump through to get to online play. The Finger remedy is just so symbolic of so much of what is wrong with Elden Ring's co-op vision. It adds nothing new and seems to just be the same old system that hasn't evolved, tacked onto a game where everything has evolved past it. So this concludes my critique on the co-op section of this game. I think what ultimately weighs co-op down is all of these unexplained rules that are really due to technical or design limitations, such as co-opers having to run and walk everywhere instead of riding Torrent, or having to sever out your co-opers just to grab that bonfire that's inside that mini dungeon that you can see 5 feet in front of you. It's not that I want more explanation, just that I'd like the whole experience to be a lot more seamless to the point where it needs no explanation. So let's talk about password summoning higher leveled players in this game. This is pretty different from the other 2 sections, as this has to do with an algorithm, and my other 2 critiques were about how multiplayer is implemented into an open world. But I'd argue that this particular algorithm compounds the other 2 issues to such a degree that has been my #1 issue with this game since launch. See, with all 10 of the patches FromSoft has released thus far for Elden Ring, they've gone through some very substantial shifts, from nerfing all Ash of War damage, to speeding up movesets, to recently where they just buffed all of the poise damage in the game, to make it so that passive poise as we knew it before has completely changed. And they can tweak poise, hyper armor, poise damage, all they want, but it's not going to change that none of these things matter in the face of the sheer mismatch in damage dealt and taken by overleveled summons. Before I really dive into this topic, a quick recap for those who might be watching a video of mine for the first time. Essentially, the downscaling algorithm that scales higher level summons down to the same level as the host doesn't scale properly. The instance I always love to bring up is how arcane status effect buildup doesn't scale down at all, meaning that the bleed buildup and scaling that a rune level 300 phantom with fully upgraded weapons does at rune level 300 doesn't change at all when they get downscaled to, say, rune level 40 or rune level 80. But the bigger issue here across the board for all different types of builds is that damage doesn't downscale properly in the slightest, leading downscaled overleveled summons to do ridiculous amounts of damage in both PvE and PvP. Something else that's not even addressed in the downscaling algorithm itself are damage defenses, which are raised when you level pretty much any stat. So by virtue of simply having more stats, overleveled summons take dramatically less damage, because less damage gets through their defenses. For example, an attack from an enemy or an invader may deal 180 damage to a host, let's say. But when that same attack hits an overleveled summon, that damage might not even crack 100, and that's going to be just due to the sheer amount of stats they have that builds up their defenses. There is no defense downscaling calculated into the algorithm. I firmly believe that this downscaling issue is incredibly important to both PvE and PvP, so let's talk about PvE first. I'm not going to try to gatekeep the difficulty of this game. In fact, I think FromSoft finally has sidestepped the difficulty debate by just adding in spirit summons. They changed the difficulty in a fun and uniquely FromSoft way by making the difficulty option a tool that fits cohesively into the world, rather than a clunky menu option that belittles the player, buried within the UI of a pause menu. I'm talking about spirit summons because I feel like that's essentially what summon players have been in past games, and what they were supposed to be in this game. Someone to aid you in your quest, not someone to just play the game for you. I feel like in Elden Ring, more than any other FromSoft game, has this dynamic where overleveled summons carry their hosts through the game, barely letting them engage in combat while they do most of the work. I know this from my own experience of being summoned as a random cooperator into a world with overleveled summons, but mostly from invading worlds with overleveled summons. And from a design and narrative standpoint, the host is the main character of their world and that co-op session, so why is someone else doing all of the damage, casting massive AoE blasts that nuke every enemy before the host can even reach them? Look, I'm not going to tell people how to play the game here, but I will say that it does dramatically weaken the overall effect of the main story, where you, the host of that world, is the only being worthy to take the throne of Elden Lord, but someone else is doing all of the real work to place you on that throne. Godfrey's iconic line of "thy strength befits a crown" kinda rings hollow here. If this were a video essay made in the year 2016, made by an armchair game dev who watched a GDC talk once about ludonarrative dissonance, I'd give you a lengthy spiel about what that means, and bring up examples like Uncharted's Nathan Drake mowing down hundreds of people in order to obtain archaeological artifacts, and maybe even throwing in some Joss Whedon-esque quips along the way. But I'm not going to do this, even if those points I just mentioned are valid. Instead, what I will say is that these games simply aren't that fun to be carried through without actually learning how to play the game. The combat of these games is legitimately great, made clear by the fact that massive franchises like Assassin's Creed and God of War adapted the Souls-like combat and control scheme, but made them just a little bit more accessible. But the combat of these games never becomes great if you never learn to actually engage with the systems. And I know people aren't engaging with these systems, especially when there's overleveled summons present, because I invade them and they are fat rolling, hanging around in the back and well out of the fight. Maybe casting spells, or using a projectile Ash of War, or sometimes even just sitting there doing nothing, while their overleveled summon, who does know kinda how to play the game, nukes everything with their endgame gear with lopsided damage. At a certain point, it begs the question, why did you pay money for this experience? I place less of the blame on the players who choose to play the game this way, and more on FromSoft for allowing people to take a game as great as Elden Ring, and just then really not engage with anything that makes this game great. If you're watching this and thinking, hey, let people play the game how they want, I won't really argue with that, that's fair. But letting the worst aspects of your game become essentialized due to design flaws is still bad design. For example, it'd be like the early quests in RPGs like Fallout New Vegas, or maybe something a little bit more modern like Baldur's Gate 3. What if all of those push you to resolve every situation with violence, instead of showing you the real reason to play RPGs, that being the various choices and really all the different role-playing ways you can resolve situations? So sure, you could resolve every situation in those games with violence, and honestly there are some goofy challenge runs out there that require this, but I think you'd have a lot less fun and wouldn't really get what makes those games great. Much in the same way where if you never engage with the actual combat of Elden Ring because your rune level 400 friend annihilated every boss by pressing L2 3, maybe 4 times, I think you might also walk away from Elden Ring pretty unsatisfied and not really getting the hype. At least with spirit summons, it's rare that they can actually outdamage their human counterparts or take as much damage as their hosts, whereas overleveled summons can nearly one-shot some of the early game bosses the moment they are summoned. It just isn't the same. So now let's talk about PvP and its interaction with downscaling. Essentially, overleveled summons leverage their litany of advantages in the forms of superior damage, poise, absorptions, FP, defenses, and the general advantage of having more than one person, and use that to obliterate anyone who invades them. And it's not really like they shouldn't either. They should try their best to kill anyone who invades them, and the invader should never feel like they're guaranteed or owed wins in any invasion. But I do think it's really worth considering what these overwhelming odds and advantages stacked against the invader do to the overall ecosystem of co-opers and invaders. Well, it makes the invaders meaner. They can no longer win invasions with weapons they wanted to win with in the first place, and those weapons go into the bottomless box, and out come the mean weapons, the find out swords. I used to hear this argument a lot in Dark Souls 3, but I never really cared a ton about it because overlevels weren't that big of a deal. They were just tougher opponents with the same amount of skill as their hosts, that is to say, not a lot. I always felt like people just use this as an excuse to twink really hard, especially at places like the High Wall and Undead Settlement. But now in this game, I really do get that mentality due to just how broken the downscaling system is. Overleveleds are no longer the tankier idiots that would press R1 a little too much. Now they're unstoppable L2 poise machines, or light rolling wizards that will delete you with 2 spellcasts in the span of a second and a half. Or what you'll find more commonly is just the player that does really good damage and can use absolutely everything. I'm talking about the bull-goated wizard with a fingerprint shield that can also sometimes cast Death Lightning, and of course all of these spells will delete your entire health bar if they hit you. I'm not going to spend a lot of time getting into the kind of PvP war crimes you can commit by ganking with overleveled summons, because I think as many of you in the PvP community already experienced, it happens constantly. But I will touch on it nonetheless. There are few things more frustrating in this game than someone who is clearly looking for PvP by turning on the Taunter's Tongue that has also summoned their rune level 400 friend to kill all of the invaders for them. And it's not so much losing to these parties that bothers me, it's knowing that they're not really looking for fights, they're just looking to be on the winning team. So now we roll both of these PvE and PvP issues together, and what do we get? We have playthroughs where the host gets all aspects of the game done for them. Menacing and powerful bosses fail to deliver on their impact and scale in the story because someone comes in and beats them in a matter of seconds. Invaders that once felt like a matchup against a much smarter enemy than anything that the game has to offer, a challenge that required coordination and a careful approach, now are no more than just speed bumps on the way to the next grace point or fog wall. And as I've pointed out before, and will continue to point out in the next section of this video, the open world aspects of this game truly exacerbate the fact that overleveled summons are a complete balance mismatch in all aspects of multiplayer. In the midst of all this discussion about broken downscaling, I've heard many invaders suggest that players shouldn't be able to summon their overleveled friends at all in this game, and that if you want to play with your friends, you should just both start new builds and play with people that are at your same level. And I really disagree with this sentiment, and I especially disagree with it in the context of Elden Ring. I think it would be dramatically easier for FromSoft to just fix their downscaling algorithm, an algorithm that many members of this community have already determined mathematical fixes for that would function in a far smoother and balanced way than what we currently have. Like I mentioned before, this game is absolutely massive and kind of a huge hassle to play due to co-op progress not carrying over. So I don't really blame people who summon their overleveled friends who have already beaten the game, because I wouldn't necessarily want to play this massive 150-hour campaign again and do everything twice with a new character on the whim of one of my friends. Invaders have this joke about Timbo and Bubba, where Bubba is the overleveled friend guiding little Timbo through their first playthrough of the game. And honestly, I'm a little tired of this joke. It can be funny. It was funny when Saint Riot was doing it. Way back in, Dark Souls 3, but the way other invaders beat this joke into the ground just often comes across as name-calling. But regardless, the main reason invaders would always clown on Bubba of this situation was always because they were some overleveled friend who, instead of just creating a new character, would just use their wildly overleveled endgame character to carry their friend through the game. And in past games, I felt like that was definitely something to mock. Like, really, you couldn't just play through the game again with your friend. No, you gotta show off your endgame armor and your endgame weapons to really drive home to your buddy that you're better than them at this game. Maybe that's a little overly critical in retrospect, but it was always a little bit of an ego thing. Like, really, you gotta use the final boss's weapon for, making your way through the high wall of Lothric? Really? In past games, I feel like you get a lot more people willing to play through the entire game again with their friends on fresh characters, with both characters doing everything twice. But like I've said before, the size of Elden Ring truly discourages this. And so I really don't buy into the whole Bubba and Timbo narrative for every co-op group I see with overleveled summons anymore. Because I don't even want to play through this game again, and I love this game. A full playthrough requires just so much goddamn game to get through, and you have to do it twice if you're co-oping with someone. From my experience, I encounter far more similarly leveled players co-oping together at rune level 30, 40, and 60 than I do at all other rune levels. And my theory is that at a certain point, those players just get tired of how much of the game there is to play, and decide just to give up on that and just have one person actually play through the game, and the other person summon their other characters to assist them. And that's kind of why I don't really buy into the whole Timbo and Bubba thing anymore. I just really can't fault any of these co-op groups from not wanting to invest so much time just to do one simultaneous playthrough. And while downscaling is truly atrocious in this game, it's not like co-opers really know anything about it. They're just kind of ignorant of how unbalanced it all is. The last thing I'll say about downscaling is that it's regrettable that the least fun way to play the game with friends is the one that this game pushes you towards due to its sheer size and overall clunkiness in its systems. One thing I've heard many game designers say before is that, given the chance, gamers will optimize the fun out of a game, and I feel like Elden Ring has given their players every incentive to do just that. And now for the section that I personally find to be the greatest letdown of this game's multiplayer, open world invasions. Now, many invaders might expect me to talk about a litany of very real problems with PvP in this game, like damage in this game being wildly high, making the TTK pretty damn low, or the fact that there are several weapon classes that are just not remotely competitive with other weapon classes in PvP, or hit stun priority being completely out of whack, or the general feeling that FromSoft can't really seem to make up their minds about what they want to do with poise and hyper armor in this game, etc. The list goes on. I'm mentioning all of these things because there are general flaws with PvP in this game, yes, but what I'm instead going to focus on is how the multiplayer systems in this game often do nothing to improve, or at worst make open world invasions extremely unenjoyable for both invaders and the invaded. Let's start with the fact that the open world is mostly empty space between groups of enemies. This is not a criticism of FromSoft's open world design, this is just how open worlds typically are, because filling every ounce of space with groups of enemies is incredibly annoying. The Far Cry games started doing this around Far Cry 4, constantly badgering the player with enemies at every turn in the road to the point where exploration became a chore. Thankfully, Elden Ring does not do this, but it just leads to the inevitable fact that most of the people you invade in the open world of Elden Ring are just running around in an open field with no significant enemies around them for hundreds of meters. Why? Well, like we talk about, the only way to traverse the open world in co-op is on foot, so the likelihood of invaders invading parties that are doing nothing but sprinting to the next point of interest is pretty high. That's just what co-opers spend most of their time doing in this game, thanks to a lack of decent systems that might enable a better co-op experience. This then results in invaders constantly having to fight 2 to 3 opponents with zero support from enemies and zero environmental hazards, just a 2v1 or a 3v1 in an open field. Now, a 2v1 with zero support is pretty manageable, but a 3v1 with zero support is a tough ask for any invader. Every extra player you add on the host's side makes these fights exponentially harder, and the jump in difficulty from a 2v1 to a 3v1 is undeniably significant. There's also a few issues more unique to Elden Ring that make 3v1s with no support dramatically harder. The first is what I spent the entirety of the last section talking about, which is that the downscaling algorithm makes overleveled summons absurdly powerful. This takes an already difficult fight against a few players who are at least similar in damage and health pools to the invader, and bumps one of them up to a ridiculous degree. If even one player of a 3-person party is overleveled, you pretty much just have to avoid every instance of engagement with that specific player, because like I talked about before, overleveled summons do not do or take appropriate levels of damage compared to everyone else playing at that level. The second issue is that every single build in Elden Ring has access to projectiles that do very real damage. No, I'm not talking about bows or ballistas for physical builds. I'm talking about Ashes of War that fire projectiles that primarily scale with weapon upgrade level instead of a damage stat. In the Dark Souls series, projectiles on weapons were pretty limited. In fact, I'd call it restrained. If you wanted a projectile that did real damage, you'd either have to make a build around it as some sort of mage, or resort to using a bow, crossbow, or great bow, which all featured their own drawbacks. And mages had pretty significant trade-offs in these games too. In order to get good damage from your spells, you had to make a bunch of decisions with drawbacks when build making, like wearing a spell boosting crown that also made you take extra magic damage, or having to allocate points away from vigor and vitality into attunement so that you could just have spell slots and FP. Essentially, there were actual benefits and drawbacks to being a mage. Sure, you could have your free damage from a range, but in return, you'd be more vulnerable when you did get hit. That's just good build making rules. Elden Ring's build making philosophy kinda goes completely against that. Want to have a projectile that does real damage? Easy, they're basically free in this game. By my count, there's 13 different Ashes of War that fire projectiles in this game that you can just slap on to any infusible weapon. And I'm not even going to go through and count the staggering amount of unique weapons that have Ashes of War that fire high damaging and almost worst of all, fast projectiles. The worst defenders are Moonveil, Reduvia, and Falling Star Beastjaw for their sheer damage potential and speed of projectile, but I'm sure any invader knows this already. What bothers me the most is that all of these Ashes of War only kind of scale off of different stats, but they mostly scale off of weapon upgrade level, which is a baffling decision. Now literally every build in the game has access to stuff like Glintstone Pebble, which is just a better version than the spell with the exact same name, or Flaming Strike, which is just better than any pyromancy in the game, or Sacred Blade, which is just a free damaging projectile that buffs your weapon and costs a tiny amount of FP. So now there's no trade-off for your free damage from a range like mages had to make in the Dark Souls series. Everyone gets free damage at the cost of a tiny, tiny FP tax. Hell, there's stuff like Stormblade and Beast Roar that scale off of both weapon upgrade level and purely physical stats. Why do physical builds get both all the benefits of being a physical build and the range damage of mages with zero of the drawbacks? It points to a lack of balance when one class is just all benefits and no drawbacks. If you're wondering where I'm going with the complaining about all these projectiles and how that relates to invasions in the open world, it's this. There are far too many projectiles that do very real damage being fired off at any given moment, and ultimately it's just too much for one player to keep all three players firing projectiles on one screen. An invasion against three people with projectiles is just entirely unapproachable for an invader. I'm not saying nobody should be able to fire projectiles at an invader, but I am saying that there should be risks to making builds centered around projectiles. In previous games, some of the hardest invasions to win were invasions that involved one player with melee weapons and another with a ranged attack. And that could also be very fun, because it became a game of the party defending their mage that output a lot of damage, while the invader tried to take them out and even the odds. Now, that's pretty much every invasion and every party that you meet in Elden Ring, except there's no interesting dynamic of defending the mage because everyone's a mage that just does good damage with both melee weapons and projectiles. And like I mentioned before, the biggest issue here for me at least is just it's kind of impossible to keep everyone and all of their projectiles on screen at once when fighting just a 3v1 with no support. And to drive this home further, if one member of that party is an overleveled summon, those projectiles might be doing half to a third of your health with every single hit. So my last and perhaps most niche issue with 3v1s that I don't see talked about a lot is how fighting on hills or inclines is a terrible experience that the combat is simply not very well designed for. Back in Dark Souls 3, we used to constantly talk about not fighting people on stairs, because the consistency of spacing goes out the window and the hitboxes stop making sense. Essentially, everything becomes unpredictable because the combat for both PvE and PvP is designed to be done on flat surfaces. There's a reason every boss fight in this game is fought in a room with a big flat surface. And the one boss fight in the game that is fought on an incline has a million issues due to the very fact that it's fought on an incline. Hitboxes, but especially weapon tracking, are all designed with a flat surface in mind. So when players are then fighting on inclines, attacks often don't seem to take height into account at all. So you'll have swings from weapons that should hit your opponent, but instead fly over their heads because they're standing lower than you on a hill, or running attacks that should reach a player, but instead miss because the tracking of that weapon guides you to swing directly into a hillside instead of your opponent. Now, I know there were plenty of inclines in the Dark Souls series, this isn't a new concept. Hell, a very large portion of the Ring City was just one long alleyway of stairs, and yes, fighting on those stairs was a bit of a nightmare for that reason too. But the greater issue here is that far more of Elden Ring sits on an incline than in past games due to the nature of it being open world. Half of Limgrave sits on a hill, the banks of the Lake of Liurnia are all sloped, Mount Gelmir is basically all one big climb up to Volcano Manor, and the mountaintops of Giants is, well, a mountain. I'm not saying this whole game is unplayable in PvP because of the amount of hills and slopes in the game, but there's just so many more spaces than in the past where the combat feels dramatically worse because of this incline issue. And the overwhelming majority of them exist in the open world and aren't really avoidable. In past games, if you didn't want to fight on the stairs, you could just not stand on a particular flight of stairs. In Elden Ring, if you don't want to fight on a slope, you might have to go to an entirely different area. This could be remedied by some better vertical tracking and attacks on FromSoft's end, but I'm not sure how difficult that would be, or if FromSoft has any interest in making those changes at this point. Instead, we're kind of stuck with another instance of FromSoft not making the necessary accommodations for the nature of their open world. So when you add it all up together, the broken downscaling making certain summon players entirely unapproachable, the projectile spam, and the likelihood of combat being hampered by having to fight on inclines, I think Elden Ring's version of fighting a 3v1 is probably the worst it's ever been in a FromSoft game. And what happens as a result of that? You get invaders who literally just never engage unless they have some sort of advantage over the host. It's an incredibly annoying and boring way to invade, but after everything I've just mentioned, it's a little hard to blame invaders for playing like that. To be fair, I still do absolutely blame them, and think if you truly only care about winning in a game like Elden Ring, perhaps there are other games you should be playing or grass you should be touching. But on the other hand, there are just so many design choices at work here that push invaders to just never engage with a party that the game has almost conditioned them to play like this. I may make it seem like every invasion in this game is an unwinnable 3v1, but we know that's not the case. What I take more of an issue with is just how common 3v1s are in Elden Ring due to the game's blue spirit system. In Elden Ring, anyone who uses the White Cipher ring is seemingly always delivered a blue in record time. In my experience, it's usually less than a minute before a blue shows up after invading a host with the White Cipher ring active. This was fine in a game like Dark Souls 3, where a blue might show up to come to the aid of a solo host, making a 1v1 with an invader into a much more evenly matched 2v1. And if that carries on for a while, maybe a couple of minutes, that becomes a 3v1. What happens in Elden Ring far more often is that 2v1s become 3v1s almost instantly upon invading a party if they have the White Cipher ring. It takes what was a fairly evenly matched fight with no other PvE involved, and pushes it to a fight that is incredibly difficult to win without the hosting party doing something ill-advised like forgetting to level Vigor or running directly into a group of enemies. Which is annoying, yes, but what I find far more aggravating is when the invader kills a member of the host's party and that member is immediately replaced by a blue. Like, congratulations, your reward for playing well is that more players show up for the host's side. This seems like a bit of an oversight here. It's once again the result of a vestigial system that doesn't belong in a game that has evolved past the previous iterations. In Dark Souls 2 and 3, blue spirits would be summoned to the worlds of hosts who had been invaded, and that in my opinion was a fantastic system. But the key here was that those were primarily solo hosts who summoned blues. And solo hosts needed other blue sentinels or Blades of the Darkmoon in order to even the odds against invaders, and honestly there was even a sense of honor belonging to one of these covenants, mostly because of how infrequently you were summoned for them. Blues were also great for advancing invasions, as they would often charge forward into the level to take on the invader, usually bringing the host and maybe whoever the host had summoned along with them. Blues were stalemate breakers, because they had finally been summoned for that covenant and weren't going to wait around while the host sat at the bonfire or the invader sat behind enemies. This was a great thing for all parties involved. It would force the host to move or the invader to attack, and someone would emerge victorious from that, with either the invader killed by an aggressive and courageous party or the host and their party would fall to the invader with the enemies of the level as their support. In stark contrast, Elden Ring Blues are not like this. Elden Ring Blues don't show up to assist solo hosts in need because there is no such thing as a solo host in need in this game. Everyone who gets invaded has either already summoned help or explicitly asked to be invaded via the Taunter's Tongue. Quite honestly, I don't think any of these people deserve to have blues show up at all, because all it does is give the host's party even higher odds of never losing in a game where the odds are already purposely stacked in their favor. It provides a safety net to parties who play passively, or hosts who run away into the open world forever, or the Taunter's Tongued solo hosts who are at heart just gankers without friends. And in my opinion, none of these people really deserve the help of blues. To add insult to injury, by nature hosts are almost always a higher level than the invader by design, and blues are typically a higher level than hosts. That means the blues that most invaders are fighting are a full 2 matchmaking brackets higher than the invader. Blues now just serve as reinforcements and frontrunners for the team that already has all of the advantages. So why are they here? What value do they add to the multiplayer experience? My opinion is that FromSoft should have had the restraint here to just cut that system entirely from the game. I think what would have been a far more cohesive use of that system would have been to make blues be auto-summoned co-opers that are summoned to the worlds of solo hosts who just want the help of random players in PvE. Instead of having to pick up signs of randoms around summoning pools, solo hosts could just turn on the white cipher ring and have co-opers show up in their world and help them with the PvE. This system would also solve a few other complaints I've heard on both sides of invasions having to do with activity. I've heard quite a few hosts complain that the moment they summon their friends for co-op, they immediately get invaded. This is largely due to the fact that there often are a plethora of invaders looking for an invasion, but only so many active co-op groups. Invaders, on the other hand, will complain about the exact same thing, but in a different way. They'll just say that there's no activity and the game's dead. There's a whole other section of this video that I've cut because it's only adjacently relevant, but the gist of it was basically telling invaders to just shut up about activity for like 5 seconds. But we're not going to get into that right now. We're saving that for another time. Anyways, this change to blue spirits would dramatically increase activity in such a way where invaders would have more activity, but also hosts co-oping with their friends wouldn't be the only people who are getting invaded. They would still be open to invasions, but they just wouldn't be at the very top of the priority queue for every single invader. So to wrap up this section, blue spirits as they've existed in the past don't really belong in this game, and their inclusion in this game just doesn't add anything like they once did. It highlights the greater issue of FromSoft clearly having the framework for Covenants and Elden Ring, but ultimately deciding to remove them for simplicity's sake. Blue spirits used to have an actual role and purpose in both gameplay and lore. Now they're just kind of there, doing what they've always done, but in a far worse way, without a real purpose. They kind of just ensure that invasions always become 3v1s if the white cipher ring is involved, and it's all made dramatically worse by a few other systems at play in Elden Ring, that being the lowered world player cap and the changes to the Taunter's Tongue. In past games like Dark Souls 3 and Dark Souls Remastered, the player cap was raised to 6 players per world, meaning a player could summon up to 3 other friendly phantoms, but also be potentially invaded by up to 2 other players. There's actually quite a bit of nuance here depending on what area you're in and what covenants are active. For example, just the other day in Dark Souls Remastered, I was summoned into a host's world in Darkroot Forest for what I can only assume was some sort of psychotic survivalist host with a dried finger active who then allowed 3 forest hunters and 2 dark wreaths to invade before they showed themselves. I think whatever montage the host was hoping to make for themselves by backstabbing us all a million times did not quite work out. But for now, just know that in past games the most players that could exist in a world at a time was 6. Elden Ring went and lowered that world player cap to 4. Now I've heard that the decision was due in large part to the fact that this game also launched on last-gen consoles, and the performance on those consoles took a massive hit the more players were present in a world. So I understand the decision. I really disagree with it, and I think it sucks, but I get why it had to be done. What I don't understand is why they messed with how the dried fingers equivalent works in this game, and why they made it so insanely easy to abuse with the lowered player cap. See, now with the lowered player cap, parties of 3 will turn on the Taunter's Tongue looking for invaders, and then just run around the map and bulldoze the single invader that spawns in. There isn't a chance of another invader getting in because the world player cap is maxed out with 3 members of the hosting party, leaving only 1 spot left for an invader. I'll come back to this example in just a second. But in past games, if you turn the dried finger on, it stayed on until you either died or warped to another location via bonfire. I appreciate that perhaps FromSoft wanted to change how this worked for the Tanner's Tongue, so that you're not perma-invaded while you try to navigate the vast open world of a region. What I don't appreciate is why they thought it was a good idea to allow hosts to turn the damn thing off entirely on a whim. See, with that earlier example of the party of 3 with the Tanner's Tongue active, the invader does actually have one opportunity to get another invader into the world. The only way to do that is by killing a member of the hosting party, thus opening up a spot in the world for an invader. So let's say an invader manages to take out a member of that 3v1, which, by the way, is I think the hardest kill to get in Elden Ring invasions. It's just like the first member of a 3v1. Because a 2v1 is manageable, and then, chasing down the host is its own thing. But just surviving the 3v1 long enough to isolate and take out one member of the party is pretty difficult. But in this instance, all the host has to do to prevent another invader from showing up is to turn the Tanner's Tongue off. Like, that's it. They can just choose to say, no thank you, I only want PvP when the odds are completely stacked in my favor. I can't even risk the odds of that not occurring. The host then has free reign to go resummon the player that was killed, or even just turn on the white cipher ring to continue to top off the world with blues. This change to the Tanner's Tongue just leads to so much abuse by players specifically looking to gank. The classic example I run into far too often is that a solo, rune-arced host will have the Tanner's Tongue activated, and the moment an invader arrives in the world, they'll turn the Tanner's Tongue off. They'll of course have already turned on the white cipher ring, making it so that the world essentially gets locked to a 3v1, with blues arriving to replenish any of the other blues that get killed. In my opinion, if we're going to stay at this 4-player world cap, then the Tanner's Tongue should also cap the host party at 2 players, leaving 2 player slots available for 2 invaders whenever the tongue is active. Otherwise, the Tanner's Tongue really lacks any of the risk it should have. Invaders are only allowed into the host's world on the host's terms, like when they've assembled all of the odds in their favor. And when those same odds start to go against the host, they can just choose then to back out of this predicament whenever they feel like it. Maybe this is just FromSoft's new philosophy on PvP when it comes to Elden Ring. Hell, even summon red duelist phantoms are able to be severed out by the hosts who summon them, so maybe that's just what FromSoft wants for PvP in this game. Personally, I absolutely hate that as a design philosophy, and think it goes against a tenet they established over the course of 3 games, but hey, that's just me. The YouTuber Illusory Wall has mentioned this before, but a lot of people feel like there should be something in between never getting invaded as a solo host and the Tanner's Tongue. Or maybe you get pushed to the front of the invasion queue after activating an item, but don't stay there forever like you currently do with the Tanner's Tongue active. I think this would be a far better solution than allowing hosts to simply turn off the Tanner's Tongue, because while it can be used honestly, more often it is not. There is one more point here that I wanted to make about the lowered world player cap and Tanner's Tongue changes, and that is that fight clubs are pretty much now all but dead. Now, I don't really like fight clubs. I never sought them out before in Dark Souls 3, but also didn't go and actively bust them up either. I'm talking about fight clubs here though, because I understand their importance to the multiplayer ecosystem of these games. Fight clubs were where a lot of new players got into PvP in Dark Souls 2 and 3. Invading seems to induce this sort of anxiety in players the first couple of times they invade. I think the fact that it's an actively antagonist action against other players causes this. But fight clubs are a way in which new players can get their bearings in PvP without diving headfirst into an invasion. This was an especially effective gateway to invasions in Dark Souls 3, where most invasions were going to be versus multiple players. And how can you expect to beat multiple players at once if you don't even know how to fight one player first? Fight clubs were always my recommendation when people asked how to get into PvP in the Dark Souls games. Because for some reason, YouTube and Reddit's advice was always make a level 125 build and go to the arena. Like, that is the worst place to get into PvP, because you are going to be fighting people who have been playing this game non-stop for a very long time and you are just getting started. So fight clubs would work like this. Hosts would turn the Dreadfinger on, summon a phantom or 2, and then start picking up red duelist signs. They might also turn on blues so that you'd have this constant stream of friendly and unfriendly phantoms entering their world, always populating the fight club with new faces. Essentially, these were just low-pressure PvP situations that would also expose new players to the way other players approach the game. While waiting for your turn to fight, you would watch the other duels happening in front of you, and as a new player, that was really helpful to observe. Like I've said practically 1,000 times so far in this video, This is not the case in Elden Ring. Functionally, fight clubs cannot happen in the way they have in the past due to the lower world player cap. Whenever an invader enters a world and sees a host and a summon phantom sitting around a site of grace, that just looks like a normal invasion. And that invader has to trust, and I mean really trust, that this is a fight club and not just an invasion that hasn't gotten started yet. Because there are less players in the world, there's little to no learned behavior from other players around you. The way invaders and blues would cooperate in the fight clubs of games past is they would see that nobody else is ganging up on the host and would just settle down and go with the flow. In Elden Ring, there just aren't enough players in a world at any given time to learn that behavior. If there's a fight going on when another player enters the world, you'll just see them join in on any side, regardless of whether or not they know who to attack. This game has been out for a year and a half, and I still get attacked by my co-invaders. And hell, I still very frequently see blues attempt to attack the host, a player they cannot damage or even lock onto. So new players aren't learning to join fight clubs, and veteran players aren't really willing to participate in them anymore, due to the fact that fight clubs that are just getting started look like regular invasions. And I think at this point, organic fight clubs are all but dead in Elden Ring. Sure, they can still happen, but they pretty much all have to be coordinated outside of the game because Elden Ring simply doesn't have the infrastructure to support it. That's ultimately a bad thing for new players. The only way new players can start to get into invasions is just to throw themselves into it, which is a steep uphill battle. Sure, there is the arena, but it's most active at meta, which is not something I'd recommend for players just starting to get into PvP. Going from only knowing how to fight PvE to having to learn how to fight 3 players at once is quite a large jump, and I think the entire multiplayer ecosystem suffers because of this. So, we've largely covered the vestigial aspects of why invasions seem to struggle in Elden Ring. Essentially what was carried over from previous games that simply doesn't work or got dramatically worse in this game. Now it's time to talk about the changes FromSoft did actually make in an effort to adapt invasions to an open world setting. Let's start with the most successful one, in my opinion, that being hiding invader player character models if they crouch in bushes. This was an excellent addition to the game, and allows for stealthy approaches and playstyles to actually be relatively viable. It's a smart way for the invader to be able to use their environment to their advantage. Sadly, this is where the compliments stop and the criticism begins. I'd say this is the only meaningful mechanic that FromSoft implemented that allows invaders to use the open world to their advantage. Because let's contemplate for a moment what happens when you go to Caelid, or Mount Gelmir, or the mountaintops of Giants. That's right, there's no bushes. That advantage is entirely gone for those areas, and there's really nothing else that those areas have to offer invaders. Next, we should talk about the Phantom Bloody Finger, which I'd say was a fair attempt to give invaders a significant advantage in all invasions, but especially in open world invasions. However, I don't think the community quite grasped what the actual point of this item was when it was first introduced in the closed network test way back in October of 2021. Initially, it seemed like a repositioning tool for when invaders were cornered or generally in a bad position in an invasion. In fact, in the network test, it even had a bit of poise to it, where you had to be hit by something with pretty significant stun, or poise damage I guess, in order to get staggered out of it. We were also given 10 of these items, which everyone agreed was probably too many. But then the game actually launched, and we all discovered the true purpose of the Phantom Bloody Finger, a repositioning tool for when your spawn point is nowhere near the host in their party. This is part of a larger issue with FromSoft's spawn points for invaders, where very frequently your spawn point only seemed to take into account the x-axis in terms of proximity to the host, but not the y, meaning that often you'll be close to the host on, say, a map from the top-down perspective, but they may be nowhere near you in terms of vertical distance. This is especially egregious in Mount Gelmir, where your opponents might be several mountain passes above you, and your spawn point is at literally the lowest point of the mountain. Your opponent could be up near the Falling Star Beast, but you'd be at the very bottom near Seathwater Terminus. Now, the issue with the spawn points, in my opinion, could be remedied by simply adding more spawn points as post-launch support, which is something that FromSoft has never done, ever, in any of their games. So it just seems like the real purpose of the Phantom Bloody Fingers is to find you another spawn point, but they don't even really do that. What happens more often than not is you'll use a Phantom Bloody Finger, sit through a loading screen, and then appear in the exact same spawn point as before, accomplishing nothing except wasting your time. And there's a couple of easy fixes here that FromSoft just seems unwilling to implement for one. The first and easiest fix would be that the Phantom Bloody Finger does not respawn you at the same spawn point twice in an invasion. I feel like I don't have to elaborate on why that's an easy and beneficial fix. Another would be allowing invaders to choose their spawn points after fully fading out when using the Bloody Finger. I know this probably breaks some of FromSoft's design rules about how they like to spawn in invaders, but I do think being able to pick your spawn points would add a tactical element that is certainly missing from the Phantom Bloody Fingers as they currently are. Oh yeah, and give us back the poise upon using the Phantom Bloody Fingers. It's not that big of a deal, I'm just not sure why they took that one away in the first place. FromSoft has pretty much always had a bit of an issue with their spawn points for invaders in all of their games. And while I appreciate that they attempted to fix this long-standing issue, I feel like they went about it in the wrong way and failed to solve the issue anyways. As a last note, I should also mention that for about a year there was a bug where using the Phantom Bloody Fingers would unscale any summoned phantoms in the world. That means any players that were, say, rune level 200 being summoned into a rune level 70 player's world would suddenly ignore the downscaling system entirely and start doing rune level 200 damage to invaders. It's a testament to just how bad the downscaling algorithm is in the first place that nobody noticed until like 10 months after launch. That has now been fixed, thankfully. Outside of the Phantom Bloody Fingers, it doesn't seem like FromSoft made a lot of other considerations for how invasions would function in the open world. Generally, I don't think they considered where PvP should and shouldn't be allowed in the slightest, and at no point in their support of this game have they seemed to have taken that into consideration. That seems like pretty broad and harsh criticism, but I think there is no better example of this being true than AFK Farmers. For those who don't know what this is, it's when a host will use Torrent to reach a place in the map where only Torrent's double jumps can reach, activate the Taunter's Tongue, and then they'll just sit in there and collect runes from invaders who either die in the world or sever out. AFK farming is one of those things where if you stop and think about it for a second, you also kinda have to wonder why FromSoft never attempted to curb it in the slightest. Like, it's not playing the game at all, it's just sitting in an unreachable place and wasting everyone's time. I really don't care about the runes that AFK farmers collect. There are plenty of spots that would be quicker and far more profitable to farm against PvE for runes. I do care that AFK farmers take invasions away from other co-op groups and Taunter's Tongue hosts. They essentially just disrupt an ecosystem of co-op and invasions just to disrupt it, with no other gameplay purposes. Some people will complain that FromSoft removed some of their airwalking swap glitches that invaders would use to reach these players, when really we shouldn't be relying on glitches to fix a problem that should be fixed by the developers. The funny thing is, FromSoft could fix the overall issue with AFK farmers by simply reading the various community bug tickets filed about AFK farmers and their popular spots. There's already a setting that FromSoft has the ability to implement in their areas where summoning for co-op and PvP is deactivated. Look no further than boss arenas. If they would simply take locations like Lenne's Rise, the arches and pillars below the first step, the broken bridge behind the East Rea Lucaria gate, and designate them as defeated boss room type areas, then AFK farming would be over. And sure, players might find other locations to AFK farm, but isn't this the whole point of long-term multiplayer support from Software? That they continue to fix the issues that make PvP worse for the community? This sort of leads me into the next feature that attempts to implement invasions in the open world, but this one was the 1.05 patch, which added the near and far invasion searches. Now, I should be clear, this is a great patch. It is entirely necessary for the long-term survival of this game, and it's pretty much the only reason we invaders are still able to get good activity most of the time. But like what I mentioned before about AFK farmers, no real consideration was given to where invasions are being searched for. Sure, you can get invasions anywhere in the world now, but you can get some really awful places to invade. Places that really were never meant to be invaded. Places like the tiny cave outside of Rykard's boss fight, or the beach before Radahn's boss fight, or the stairway before Morgoth's boss fight, or the hallway before Radagon's boss fight. Noticing a pattern here? These levels don't have PvE or a real environment to play in, they're just loading zones between boss fights where co-opers are meant to pick up their friends before going into the boss fight. They've become these dedicated gank zones precisely because of their cramped nature, and of course are only exacerbated by the wombo combo of 3v1s and a Taunter's Tongued world. I should clarify, I don't mind that FromSoft didn't have the foresight to remove these areas upon launching 1.05. I'm more so confused as to why they weren't removed from the search pool after it's been made clear that invaders hate getting invasions in these areas, and that co-opers also hate getting invasions there when they're just trying to go fight the boss. Another thing I should also mention about the 1.05 patch is that the original idea and execution for it started as a mod for Dark Souls 3, which allowed PC invaders to search all regions for invasions. This was known as Wexdust, and one of the things that the Wexdust mod did was allow players to remove certain regions from that invasion search. For example, I removed the Post-Pontiff region from my Wexdust search because I knew that if I wanted an invasion there, I could go find one at any point and didn't always feel like invading that hellscape. This is sorely needed in Elden Ring, as most invaders would immediately just eliminate most of the regions in front of boss fog gates like I just mentioned. Personally, I'd also eliminate searches around the Boil Prawn Shack Grace Point, because if you've ever watched one of my videos, you know how much I despise the duelists who lurk around that swamp-ass shack. Allowing invaders to choose their search ranges would also fix a few other issues I've mentioned before. For example, you could eliminate AFK farming entirely without having to ever touch multiplayer regions. Invaders could just take out Lenny's Rise in the first step from their invasion searches. Another thing that I think a lot of invaders would do would just be to eliminate open world searches entirely. With all of these issues I've mentioned in this section about open world invasions, I think a lot of invaders would simply like to never engage with any of it, and instead keep invasions to the smaller dungeons and legacy dungeons. I'm not sure if I'd necessarily do that, because I do find some open world areas very fun to invade, but I think narrowing down the search areas to just the open world regions I like, and then filling the rest with legacy dungeons, would be my optimal mix. I have zero data to back this up, but hear me out. I feel like I get a lot of open world invasions in the same spots, and perhaps those areas are getting prioritized over others, not because there's just more activity in those areas, but because they're just higher up on the search queue. I'd be very curious to know if removing some of those very common invasion spots would actually result in less invasions, or if you would start to get invasions in places you hadn't really before. Again, it's all speculation here, but I would love to at least test this theory out. And worst case scenario, invaders get to choose to stop invading hellscapes like the Radon Beach or the Morgott Staircase. One of the places I'd probably remove from the invasion search immediately for myself is anywhere that would result in me invading alongside a boss in the open world. Some of you might disagree, but I firmly believe that invading open world boss fights is awful for everyone involved, and it's mostly for two reasons. The first is that both a full-fledged boss fight and an invader by themselves are each incredibly formidable opponents. So I'm a little confused as to why FromSoft thought it would be a good idea to just make the party fight both at the same time. Some invaders might complain that parties are just being passive when they refuse to engage with a boss and an invader at the same time, but I'd say that's the only smart thing to do in that situation. The boss is already being buffed by the host having a summon in their world, so it's not like if the summons faced off against the invader and left the host to fight the boss, that it would be a fair fight anyways. So again, I don't blame hosts and their parties for not wanting to engage in what is just a known unfair fight. On the invader side of things, invading alongside boss fights is a relentlessly frustrating experience. This is no Mirror Knight situation from Dark Souls 2 where you're actually on the same side as the boss. You are just present and at the same time in the line of fire of the ass kicking that boss is trying to dole out. Invading alongside a boss is a lot like having a goddamn idiot for a co-invader. One of those co-invaders who won't stop swinging wildly while you're around. Except this co-invader is like cracked out of their mind on damage and has fireballs that do half your health and will flatten your ass with a giant staff or a giant hammer. It's just aggravating for me because the boss makes absolutely no attempt to take you, an invader, into account. And sure, you can probably play around it with something like an Erdtree avatar with its simplistic moveset, but it's kind of impossible to play around something like any of the dragons in this game. In fact, I've had multiple instances where upon spawning into a world as an invader, I'll have a dragon just target and obliterate me, like the game mistook me, the closest player, for the host or a friendly summon. So most of the time, the optimal strategy is to just stand back and fire something big, like a jar cannon or a giant angry fireball at the party, while standing clear of any potential attacks from the boss. And personally, I don't think any of that is good design. An encounter where the systems combines the optimal strategy is to run away and try to shoot your opponents from a distance is not a great or memorable sequence of events that is supposed to be taking place in a game based around magic and swords. This all isn't to say that invasions as part of boss fights can't be fun ever. I think there's a lot of ways that FromSoft has tried to incorporate PvP into boss fights that have been successful, most notably the Spears of the Church fight in Dark Souls 3. I think the way in which the Invader was incorporated into Dark Souls 2's Mirror Knight was very cool, but it wasn't actually a great or meaningful use of PvP due to how lopsided the outcomes of that fight would be if an Invader was actually summoned. But the way that boss fight invasions are currently implemented is just unfun for all parties involved in Elden Ring. They really just turned on friendly fire for bosses hitting invaders and called it a day. And like many other things in the multiplayer of Elden Ring, it simply wasn't enough to make it successful. In conclusion of the biggest section of this video, FromSoft essentially took the invasion format from Dark Souls 3 and carried it directly into Elden Ring with a few small features and adjustments. The problem is that the open world setting and decreased world player cap made it so that the original format of invasions no longer maintained the balance and engagement that it did in previous games. This is only made worse by most of the features that were implemented to improve invasions failing to actually accomplish their tasks. Look, I like invasions in Elden Ring, but I really don't derive the same kind of joy from them that I did with Dark Souls 2 or Dark Souls 3. And I think that's due to so many of these system failures resulting in a lot more meaningless invasions in Elden Ring than ever before. Invasions where I spawn in and I spend 5 minutes chasing the host across a flat lake until they die to PvE. Invasions where I spawn in and it's 2 people and Melina about to fight Morgott, so they chase me around a staircase for 3 minutes before giving up and fighting Morgott down half their flasks. Invasions where I spawn in and it's just an AFK farmer. Invasions where I start fighting a party only to get 2-shot by an overleveled summon who's a wizard. Invasions where it's the same Taunter's Tongue to host at Boil Prawn Shack who light rolls until blues show up. There just weren't these kind of problems in past games at all. Sure, late stage Dark Souls 3 had its glitch meta era, and Dark Souls 1 and 2 still have their enormously sweaty PvP lifers, and Bloodborne has that exact same problem, but probably much worse, and the activity is entirely dead except when it's October. But none of these games have the problems that Elden Ring invasions are plagued with constantly on a daily basis, and they're all entirely due to the multiplayer systems and their failures. I know I've just spent this entire video essentially just tearing the multiplayer aspect of Elden Ring a new one, but I think it's important to recognize something that I feel like a lot of YouTube video game critics don't tend to do at the end of their video essays. Looking at you, Joseph Anderson. I'm not a video game designer. Yes, I work at a video game studio, and in my recent role I work a whole lot closer to the design team, but that's far more to do with the type of studio that I'm at than my current role. But I'm certainly not a member of the design team, nor do I pretend that I am. Video games are incredibly difficult to make, and if you ask me to make substantial changes to a game like Dark Souls 3, a game I have around 2,000 hours in, I bet you a lot of those changes would be hated by the average player. And perhaps a ton of these changes that I'm proposing are for some reason impossible to implement for the From Software team, and I'm just some asshole on the internet telling the people who make their games that I know better. FromSoft has made a legacy and its own damn genre of games by flat-out ignoring modern tenets of design philosophy, so it always feels a bit foolish leveling this great critique against them. But I do feel disheartened, as I felt like FromSoft has been making progress on improving their multiplayer experience for the last decade, only to take a huge step back with the game that Miyazaki himself calls the culmination of everything they had been trying to do with the Dark Souls series. We've seen so many improvements and welcome additions to the multiplayer systems during the Dark Souls series, like an increased world player cap, the password summoning system, weapon upgrade matchmaking, the removal of armor upgrades, and a litany of interesting player covenants over the course of 4 games. And then Elden Ring takes a step back in so very many of these categories, lowering the player cap, removing covenants, and adding very little that functionally changes multiplayer in a positive way, outside of course the near and far searching capabilities added in the 1.05 patch. Which, as I've mentioned, was an idea that was originally a community-created mod for Dark Souls 3 to increase invasion activity. This was not something FromSoft came up with on their own. To be frank, I don't think FromSoft put a lot of emphasis on multiplayer at all for this game, and assumed that their previous systems would mostly function just fine. Sure, they added the Phantom Bloody Finger, which, as I've discussed, doesn't functionally fix the problem it was created to solve. And sure, we also have the 1.05 patch adding the near and far searches, but it's a very troubling patch, not because of what it added, but because of what it tells us. Obviously, it's a phenomenal patch. It makes organic co-op and invasions functional when the game isn't hitting launch numbers of 7-figure player counts. What it tells us, though, is that it really didn't occur to FromSoft that multiplayer would desperately need these things to properly function in an open world. The fact that they really expected co-opers to place their signs at the summoning pools and have them show up only in that one area in the entire map is baffling to me. The fact that they really expected invaders to teleport around the absurdly large map to one of the 100 different races and spam the Bloody Finger to find one invasion is also baffling. I think ultimately this was the product of a game that ballooned in scope and then barely had time to meet its deadline without leaving more room for multiplayer changes, but more on that in just a little bit. If you're here at this point in the video, you've just watched many minutes of me ranting about why I find the multiplayer in Elden Ring to be a comparably poor experience to previous FromSoft games. But I should also clarify here that I'm not actually mad at FromSoft. For one, I think being in a constant state of anger at game developers is a pretty cringy attitude to have in general, and requires some self-reflection as to why you're constantly falling for rage bait. If at some point in the last year or so you've unironically used the term lazy devs, I suggest you unsubscribe from that YouTube channel made by a dude who has a cursory knowledge of C++ but has never worked on a game in their life, or stop following that subreddit filled with literal children. I'm not angry or mad at FromSoft here because most of the PvE focus of Elden Ring really is a masterpiece, and that's ultimately what drives the sales that allows them to get more resources to make their games better and have more sway with their publisher. And so this leads me to my theory. I believe at some point the scope of Elden Ring dramatically increased, sometime after the 2019 announcement and likely during the long period of silence during the pandemic. In this interview that accompanied the reveal trailer of Elden Ring in June of 2019, Miyazaki specifically didn't call the game open world, he instead called the game open field. He would then describe open field as something sort of akin to the open world of, say, Shadow of the Colossus. And based off of the extremely long and vague posts of Reset Era user Omnipotent, who has pretty consistently been the only FromSoft insider with correct information, they also refused to call the game open world, and instead implied a much more stripped down structure similar to that of Shadow of the Colossus. This would make a lot of sense. After all, we do know that Miyazaki is a massive fan of Team Ico's games, and hell, even the Elden Ring expansion that is on the horizon makes reference to Shadow of the Colossus with Shadow of the Erdtree. So why this theory is relevant is because I'm speculating that the earlier versions of Elden Ring were these much emptier fields through which the player would ride Torrent as transitional sections of the game between legacy dungeons. Co-op and PvP would likely only take place in those legacy dungeons, and thus their previous co-op and PvP systems would work just fine in the sections that are structured just like their previous games. But the final product of Elden Ring is clearly an open world game, with minor dungeons and points of interest scattered throughout the open world. My thinking is that this shift to fully open world along with the pandemic caused that long stretch of silence due to many internal delays, and multiplayer systems fell by the wayside while all other systems demanded higher priorities. Like I've already said, this is all speculation based on the very, very small amount of insight we have into the development of Elden Ring, based on developer interviews and a consistent leaker whose identity we cannot and probably should not verify, so take it all with a grain of salt. My final thoughts on Elden Ring's multiplayer is that we still have plenty of room for improvement that could still come in Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, but my advice would be to not hold your breath on any of it. Maybe someday we'll get an Elden Ring Game of the Year edition that is similar to Dark Souls 2's Scholar of the First Sin that makes some major changes to that game. Maybe it cuts out the Gen 4 consoles and raises the world player limit to 6 players. Maybe it lets you choose where you search for invasions with the Far Invasion search. That'd all be really neat. but I doubt any of that is going to happen. What we have is what we have, and despite my very lengthy list of complaints, Elden Ring's multiplayer is still very much worth playing, and something that I'll only continue to pour hours into. Will it have the longevity of Dark Souls 2 or Dark Souls 3's multiplayer scenes? Boy, do I doubt it. But it's the kind of game that could come very close to that, and due to the failure of its multiplayer systems, it simply doesn't. But it's so close! It's truly fruitless to just go back and forth on this over and over again, but it really is so close to a game I just want to play forever, but it's not, and so I won't. So, where do we go from here? Well, Armored Core came out a month ago. I think it's a wonderful game that I've played a lot of, that I probably won't play again anytime soon. Just not my cup of tea, and that's all I'll really say about it. But Armored Core coming out a month ago likely also means we won't hear anything about Shadow of the Erdtree for at least several more months. And the next Souls-like game from FromSoft has yet to even be announced, so what have we got to look forward to at the moment? I will say I am very curious about how other Souls-likes are going to be approaching the multiplayer aspects of their games. I think probably as this video is coming out, Lords of the Fallen is going to launch, and let me just say I am thoroughly fascinated by how that game's PvP is going to function upon release. This is a game that's going to launch with invasions that players can't opt out of, but also featuring seamless co-op, takeover, and bosses. It sounds like it even has some form of covenants. According to a recent post on Steam by the devs, they mentioned these shrines are dedicated to specific gods that's online to access. This is literally the currency that you get from invasions and multiplayer. That sounds like a covenant system to me. The devs of this game will also talk about how they put a big emphasis on how interconnected the game's world is, something that fans of Dark Souls 1 have been asking for only the last decade. You might have your reservations about this game, as this is a brand new studio making a game with an IP that did not fare well on its first iteration, trying to make something as ambitious as a Souls-like with co-op and multiplayer. This is not a declaration that this game is going